Hi, this is Stephen Greenhut, Director of the Free Cities Center project at the Pacific Research Institute. And I'm here with an old friend of mine, Professor Bill Anderson. Bill, introduce yourself to the folks watching.
Hi, I'm Bill Anderson, and retired economics professor, Frostburg State University in Maryland. And I was here for more than 20 years before I retired out here to California.
One of the issues that constantly comes up in discussions about with urbanists, the people who promote more urban living, is how transportation is funded. The urbanist movement wants to uh, push us out of our cars and rely more on transit, bicycle lanes, and walking. And they're promoting walkable
Hmm.
cities. They have some good ideas and some bad ideas. And one of the core issues that it's really hard to pinpoint is how are the roads currently funded? So, Bill, you have a new article out on the Free City Center website, and we're going to be discussing the whole issue of transportation subsidies. So, I'll start with my understanding, based on Randall O'Toole at the Cato Institute, or formerly with the Cato Institute,
Hmm.
is that through all types of funding, the highway user fee, which is the gas tax, and through local property taxes, that automobiles are subsidized to some degree 1.5 cents per mile, whereas transit is subsidized at 90 cents per mile. And bicycle lanes, well, they're basically free riders. They're
Yeah.
paid for entirely by the user fees and some local taxes. And some bicyclists, they pay property taxes, so they're paying for them to some degree, but they're basically the ultimate free rider. So, what have you found out about subsidies, and what are your thoughts on where we really stand on subsidies
Well,
today?
first, I think this is something that's very important that people forget, and that is that automobile traffic and truck traffic and the like, um, these kinds of transportation are much more efficient than anything else that we've ever come up with. And so it would be very natural that the subsidy would be lower than it would be for mass transit. That the urbanists, or should I say, the new urbanists, want us to believe that automobiles came up because of some sort of nefarious conspiratorial plot between the automakers and government officials, and that they conspired to get rid of rail transit, that they allowed the urban sprawl to open up to where you had people moving out into the suburbs, that the entire thing is just artificial, and that the true model really should be the medieval village. And now they won't use medieval village because of all the connotations, but if you get right down to the heart of it, that's what they want. They would like to take us back to the medieval village, and so thus these kinds of arguments. But the truth is that automobile traffic, with I'm talking about with all of the congestion and everything else that we have, all the negativity associated with it, the truth of the matter is that it is extremely efficient, and it has allowed us to have standards of living that simply not that many generations ago would have been unheard of.
What are the? They always say cars are subsidized. We're subsidizing all these cars. Why don't we instead subsidize transit? But transit is being subsidized, and we're actually the federal government has increased transit subsidies by over 40%
Yeah.
in the last several years. So, what have you found specifically on the subsidy issue?
What I find specifically is that what you talked about earlier, that indeed, if you really get down to honest accounting. Now, not looking, for example, the IMF came out with this report just about a month or so ago, and it said that fossil fuels are subsidized at 7 trillion a year. And so, I mean, you look at that. Whoa! All right. Well, first, how do they define a subsidy? You see, that part of it. How do we define a subsidy? And the second thing is, are your numbers even close to being correct? And so, what they do is that they assume all of the external costs, or what economists we like to call externalities. These are costs that are created by a certain activity, but not borne by the people who directly benefit. Okay, the costs are imposed on third parties who would rather not have to deal with these costs, but there they are. And so what they assume are these huge and awful externalities, just you know, this is what's happening with climate change. This is what's going on. And well, of course, there's no way to get any kind of truly what we call honest accounting. So you just basically make up numbers. I'm sorry, but a lot of this stuff is just made up. They make all of these assumptions of these costs, and all of them are almost all of them are what we call implicit costs. These are not direct costs. When you and I think of a subsidy, we talk about subsidies. What we really are thinking of, what is the dollar amount given outside of what you earn in revenues? Okay, in other words, does the government come in with a little bit extra, kind of like the way they prop up dairy farmers and with extra subsidy or farms? You have farm subsidies and things like that, where the government actually comes in with extra cash outside of what they would be making in a market, situation with regular exchanges. What these numbers are, for the most part, are implicit, made up by the people doing the study. They are highly subjective, and I say highly subjective, that's an understatement. But they do one other thing. They assume that there are absolutely no benefits whatsoever to this form of transportation, to automobile transportation, to tractor trailer, diesel transportation, for that matter, trains pulled by diesel locomotives. I mean,
I totally understand. Cars have costs, some severe ones, and but they also have benefits, and they'll never address that issue. And I don't know how to make them do it.
no, what you find is that two things. First, that they assume no benefits, but they don't look into what would have been the situation otherwise. And or even another one, why did cars develop the way they did? Why did the automobile become so popular? And what they end up doing is either almost going into what I would call metaphysics. Well, America just have a love affair with their cars. Well,
They
what the
call
heck
us
is that?
car-brained people. Is
Yeah, I
car-brained
mean,
suburbanites is what I
yeah,
hear.
I just which I mean, look, I love that 1965 Pontiac GTO as much as the next guy. All right, but at some point you get practical about it, and that's a wonderful thing about economics, is it does force us to be practical. But the point is that the automobile developed because when you take everything else into consideration, it developed better more than anything else. And yes, there are negative externalities with cars. That's why we were talking even beforehand about living in a place where we could walk. We didn't have to get in our car. We don't want to use our cars all the time. We like the idea of walkability, but the truth is that the kind of lifestyles that we have would not be possible without the kind of cost efficient mass transportation that we have with cars, trucks, and trains.
Yeah.
And that is the hard reality of it. I think that a lot of these new urbanists, they have a very romantic view of this. That somehow all of these goods would just magically appear on the shelves if we had to resort to horse-drawn wagons.
But this reminds me a little bit of another article you previously wrote for the Free City Center, talking about induced demand.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the kind of thing that frustrates me in trying to have a fact-based argument with folks who have kind of a romantic vision of how the world ought to be. And induced demand is the idea that one of their arguments is we can't keep expanding freeway lanes. There's no point in it. They just fill up anyway. And they often do fill up.
Mm-hmm.
And they call it induced demand, basically by you build the extra lane and that creates demand that didn't exist before. The way I see it is it's pent up demand. the fact that they have, in many cases here in California, we haven't been building freeways. Remember
Mhm.
when Gray Davis announced that the era of freeway building was over?
Yeah.
That's in the late 90s. And indeed, we have not been building freeways. So there's a lot of pent up demand. So you build new freeway lanes and they fill up.
Mhm.
So can you just explain what you found in that piece?
Yeah, one of the things to keep in mind, okay, number one, that cars do not exist in spontaneous generation. That they have to be produced by somebody. Somebody has to buy them. Somebody makes a decision regarding their own costs and benefits. After all, that we may talk about subsidies to automobile transit, but let's face it, that when we have a car, folks, we're the ones making the payments. We're, that no government makes any payments for me. That we're the ones having to do the upkeep and everything else. And so it's very much a cost benefit decision. My wife had this wonderful Lexus convertible. She named it Beauty. She loved that car, but when it became impractical to her, well, take it back and sell it. But here's the thing: is that what's the alternative? Okay, the alternative is packing up surface streets and the surface roads, and then now you've got this whole parade of cars going through there, as opposed to being on the freeway. And by the way, people take into account this thing called congestion. They understand it. They time, if they're going to the office or coming home, they understand that that it's going to take a certain amount of time. It'll take longer than I'm thinking of the 405. That's what I've got in mind in Los Angeles, and everybody knows about the 405. But the point is that people take that into consideration. That people really do. It's not just this. We're all pure calculators, but in a general sense, we do cost and benefit analysis because, after all, we're paying for these things. We're paying for the fuel and everything else, and whatever we pay to go into that means that we cannot spend on something else. There is what we call in economics the opportunity cost. And so the argument of induced demand I always find to be sort of silly, because what they're saying is that if we didn't build these, and people would not have any more need for cars. Well, yeah. I mean, let's say that you manage to get rid of freeways altogether, and all people had were surface roads and all that. How would that be expressed in real life? It would be expressed by lower standards of living. That would mean that the goods that you purchase at the store would be more expensive. Your life, that your life would it would be more like some of these places like in Denmark where they talk about where a beer might cost you $15 or more. I'm talking about your regular light beer kind of thing. That life is much more costly in those types of settings. That, in other words, that there are trade-offs, and they don't talk about that. They want you to think that somehow everything would be all the goods that you purchase would be the same cost. That nothing would change, except now that life would be more convenient, it would be healthier, and you could walk to and all these wonderful things. Well, I like walkability too. I spent a month in Riga, Latvia, and loved it. But there also are disadvantages, and that's why we go to the cars in the first place. And let's go back to the urbanists of about 120, 130 years ago. Back when the automobile, even in the early stages of the automobile, before Henry Ford made it affordable for a lot of regular people, when the automobile was just sort of like this luxury thing on the side. What were they worried about? They were worried about all the horse manure that was going to pile up on city streets and what to do with it, creating health hazards.
As free market people, we have faith in the average person and their ability to make choices for themselves. The
Mhm.
urbanists would have more luck, I believe, if they were trying to, instead of use planners to impose, tried to convince us and said, look, if you lived in a more walkable neighborhood, you maybe you just need one car. I think that's totally legitimate. It's something I think about. Why do I want to have an extra car if I don't need it? But I do remember Jane Jacobs, her famous quote, and I'm probably going to butcher it, is that as in all utopias, the right to have any plans of significance rested only with the planners in charge.
Oh
And
yeah.
I feel like they're making these decisions for us, where I trust that we as average people are able to make these decisions.
I agree, and there's something I think that that's really important here, and that is that planners see these as moral choices. That an automobile is a wrong, that whatever comes out of the tailpipe of an automobile is somehow a wrong. And that it's some it's their version of sin. My goodness, this goes back to the Industrial Revolution. In fact, really what the urbanists, the more hardcore of them, would like to do would be to repeal the entire Industrial Revolution. In their minds, that in olden times that society was really this wonderful place as opposed to how people really lived. And in their view, it was the Industrial Revolution that created poverty, which, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. All you have to do is read history and find out but the point I'm making is that they're like the old landed aristocracy of England, that and a lot of their things were their ideas were reflected in the English literature that we love so much, in Dickens and in Wordsworth and others, and because they did not like the changes that all of a sudden people are moving from the countryside to the city because frankly they can have a better life there, and that the landed aristocracy hated the Industrial Revolution. They just hated it precisely because it changed their lives too. It made them all of a sudden have to pay higher wages. Here's something else to keep in mind is that the road building in the United States, it really began in the 1920s. And what was the reason? It wasn't that the automobile companies prevailed in government and said, look, we want people to get out of commuter trains and get into the automobiles. The only way to do that is for you to build roads. No, they built them in response to the demand. Because more and more cars were coming out there, people wanted better roads. In other words, that what we're talking about are free choices that people made based on how they felt there would be best for their lives, their families, and the vast majority of the costs are made by the owners of automobiles and the
And the
users.
taxpayer said that through the user fee is not a very good way to fund things. I've had
No.
it described to me as, paying a bulk fee and then going to a grocery store and taking as
Yeah.
much as you can anytime you want.
Uh-huh.
But these folks don't want to make it more market oriented.
You have this top-down planning. The idea is that really smart people make all of these decisions and everybody else follows. And progressives have been pushing this for years. And of course, what happens? They come in, they make decisions. You have run into bottlenecks all over the place. You run into all sorts of problems, and ultimately, there's an outcry, and then they have to make adjustments and the like. But the notion that just because somebody has an urban planning degree from some prestigious university doesn't mean that makes them able to make choices regarding your life, your family, how you're going to live, and it's that it doesn't give them the moral status that they think it does, but also it doesn't give them the the knowledge that is needed. Yeah. Well,
But they are right that suburbia, to some degree or a large degree, developed as a kind of a government planning mechanism. Zoning is a government creation. The fact that in one suburban community, all the churches have to be in one place. That's we call it the church ghetto, and the fact that I couldn't build a grocery store or until recently a duplex in this neighborhood or my neighborhood. I
Hmm.
think anything that deregulates land uses and allows more things to happen, I like that, and I think that's a good idea, and that actually offers choices.
Yeah,
So I think that's a fair point that they make.
yeah, but here's the thing: zoning came out of that same school of thought, that
Mm.
same general school of thought that the urban planners come in, now. But look, I remember my first 10 years. I lived in a little community, a little town called Boothwyn, Pennsylvania, over very close to the oil refineries. There, at the time, it had not developed with zoning. You had all this stuff, but it developed spontaneously. It's one of the things that Jane Jacobs talked about, this kind of spontaneous development that you would see. And zoning was was part of this whole movement, especially took it really started to rise during the New Deal, because they talked about the wonderful new science of social planning, and that it was believed that these really smart people should be making plans for everybody else. And so, we shouldn't be surprised that when the Bill Gateses of the world, who are, Bill Gates was a very good entrepreneur when it came to software, but that doesn't mean that Bill Gates knows, how you should be living your life. Uh, you know,
Well, let's finish up. I think getting back to the cost issue.
yeah.
So how do we determine um, the proper cost? Do we just look at the per mileage? When we're just as a starting point, what does transit cost? What do automobiles cost? I mean, we look at the California high speed rail, which I think it's estimated well over $100 billion now. And the starter segment, at least going from Merced to Bakersfield, seems unlikely to gather large amounts of traffic. Now, how do we assess those costs?
Well, one of the
Whereas,
things to keep in mind is that the planners, these urbanists, what they believe is that people, if they really had a fair choice, then they would go to mass transit and the like. But the truth is that people have made their choices. They like automobiles. Is there a place for trains? Well, we're seeing in Florida. This is a good example. You've got the Bright Line that goes from, I believe it's Orlando, down to Miami, and it's private, turns a profit. It's expected that this is not subsidized by the government, and or if it is, it's very small subsidies. The point is that if it flows in your natural choices, but what happens in California, you think about all the ways that they try to restrict the automobile. Road diets, by the super high gas tax, by you know restricting the supply of gasoline so it's more expensive and all that. Yet, what do people do when they have a choice? They they prefer to drive.
so I think the main point is that transportation systems, ideally,
Hmm.
people should pay their own way. So
Yeah,
transit ought to pay its own way, and I think it would
yeah,
be, if it were private, it would be more likely to go like the Bright Line, or the LA to Vegas route would be more likely than
hmm
a politically created high speed rail boondoggle. We're not going to obviously have a free market transportation system, but the goal, I think, should be to point us back towards as close as we can get to people paying their own way.
Here's the thing. I think that coming up with honest numbers is not always the easiest thing, but I what I look at are the choices that people make, because at the end of the day, you've got to be, that you have to come out ahead. You have to have that little bit of a surplus. You can't, keep going in deeper and deeper and deeper into the hole. All right. That talking about with your personal choices. So people look at the personal choice that people make when they have free choice.